Hello and good day to all of you joining live, and thank you so much to all of you that will be listening later to the recording, which we will send out tomorrow. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. My name is Karen Righthand, and I am the Vice President of Corporate Marketing here at SCS Global Services. We will have Neil Mendenhall, who is our Director of ESG Strategy at SCS Consulting Services, Tavio Benetti, our program manager for our greenhouse gas footprint verification program at SCS, and Dave Jonas, our program manager for climate services here at SCS Global Services. Well, not surprising, we've had an overwhelming response to our webinar invite, confirming the palpable interest and maybe some anxiety that's been generated since the SEC issued its proposed rule for climate-related reporting. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to just say a few words about SCS Global Services. Many of you are current or past customers, and we thank you very much for that. Some of you have been doing greenhouse gas verification with us for a decade or more, and to many of you, those that do that will not be new information today, but hopefully there will be some follow-on webinars that you will benefit from. For those of you who don't know us, SCS stands for Scientific Certification Systems, which was our original name when we were founded nearly 40 years ago. Now we are bringing that 40 years of science-based experience to help companies drive toward a more sustainable future. Our experts have taken the past few months to digest the 500-page proposed rule and the SEC's questions on how to implement that rule. We went through it very carefully and submitted comments based on our experience in greenhouse gas accounting and verification. What we aim to do today is to take you through what the likely impacts will be on your business so that you can prepare. The ruling is not final and probably won't be until the end of the year. The overriding thing I want to communicate as we wade into this topic is that we are here for you and we can get you through this with the proper scientific rigor. In addition, SCS can take you beyond this reporting with many other services to build out your broader ESG portfolio, such as climate neutral certification, setting science-based targets, and many other ESG and CSR topics. The outline for today's webinar is as follows. We will have 4 key areas presented. The overview and impact, who this affects. We'll look at climate risk reporting through TCFD. We'll look at greenhouse gas inventory preparation. And finally, we will look at assurance and verification. We expect the presentation to last about 30 to 40 minutes, and we will reserve the rest of the hour for questions. Please type your questions into the questions area on your webinar interface as they occur to you. With that, let's dive in. Neil, please take it away.
Thanks, Karen. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Neil Mendenhall. I'm a Director of ESG Strategy at SCS Consulting Services. So first, I'm going to go over an overview of the proposed rule. So the SEC is proposing this new rule on climate risk disclosure, largely due to the recognition that climate-related risks are financially impacting companies. And right now, the way that companies are disclosing is largely voluntary. And because of that, they're not always comparable. And so they want to propose this new rule to make sure everybody's following the same guidance as far as calculating and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions and their risks associated with those, so investors can make better decisions and understand their risk exposure. So the main elements of the proposed rule follow sort of 3 main areas. The first of which is the disclosure of climate-related risks, and how they are managed. And they're largely looking to lean on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so the TCFD guidance, which has been out since 2017. They're also expecting the calculation and disclosure of annual greenhouse gas emissions per scope 1, 2, and 3, and we'll go over what the scopes mean for those who are less familiar later. But they are expecting that you do this per the greenhouse gas protocol guidance, and also look at any reduction targets and disclose those as well. And lastly, they have something what they call attestation, which is essentially they're looking for independent assurance or verification of your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So who does this apply to? Right now, it's the companies that are in SEC's purview are publicly traded US companies. And the way they're looking to do this is to phase this in based on fiscal year and the size of the filer or the category of the filer. So here we have large accelerated filers, accelerated and non-accelerated filers, and small reporting companies. They all have a slightly different timeline for when they'll be expected to disclose this information to the SEC. But for large accelerated filers, right now it's proposed that scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, along with climate-related risks per TCFD, are going to be disclosed for the 2023 fiscal year, which wouldn't happen, the reporting would actually happen in the following year. So for scope 3, then it would happen a year after that for large accelerated filers, if it's material, and for most companies that would probably be the case. And then they're expecting verification or an attestation of their scope 1 and 2 in that following year as well for 2024, which would be demonstrated in 2025. And then it goes down the line here, as you see, for accelerated, non-accelerated filers, it's a year later for some of these things. Right now, it looks like that it's not applicable for non-accelerated filers to have the attestation for scope 1 and 2. Small reporting companies get some exemptions. They give it delay till fiscal year 2025, and they aren't being asked to provide scope 3 calculations, nor are they being asked to have an attestation for scope 1 and 2. So that said, this is all related to publicly traded companies, but as we'll see in a later presentation about how the different scopes work, scope 3 for some of these large accelerated filers is going to be the scope 1 and 2 emissions for their entire value chain, which means eventually, if not already, they'll be coming to foreign and private companies that are in their value chain to get better information on their scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see, this is going to cascade and really impact lots of companies that are traditionally beyond the purview of SEC. So first, I'll talk about climate-related risk reporting as per the TCFD. Again, the SEC is not trying to reinvent the wheel here. Many companies have been reporting to TCFD guidance for some time, and so they're proposing that they take pieces of this, not the whole thing, but most of it, and ask that companies report per that guidance. So TCFD has 4 main sections where they ask for both qualitative and quantitative disclosures. Those are on your governance, your strategy, risk management, and finally metrics and targets. So under governance, really what they're looking for is companies to disclose how climate is being evaluated and addressed at the highest levels of the company. So usually this is the board level. No longer is it okay to have your sustainability program, is sort of a separate siloed thing. They want, they've identified that there's real risks here and financial impacts to the companies, and those should be looked at and reviewed at the highest level, and governance structures should reflect that. In addition, they're wanting to understand a little bit more of the strategy and approach. So companies are going to be asked to describe the impact of climate risks on their overall strategy and planning, and be looking at this from a short, medium, and long-term perspective. And in addition, using various climate scenarios. So in this case, 1.5 degree Celsius, future world, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. There's a number of different climate scenarios that are out there that they'll be expecting companies to use to look out into the future and describe their strategy for transition and physical risk to climate change, which gets us here to the risk management. So in addition to that, they want to see that these same issues, these risks, are being integrated into existing enterprise risk management systems that companies have. So there's two main forms of risks that they expect companies to consider. The first being a transition risk. So this is risk into the future of governments and regulators putting forward things like carbon taxes or other regulations, maybe some technology changes and other things that will impact companies, especially companies that are high emitting, and then any investments that companies have in companies that are high emitting industries. And so they understand really, are you prepared for this transition into the future to a lower carbon economy, or do you have your head in the sand? And there's going to be a disorderly transition, which will negatively impact the value of your company or your investments. In addition to that, they're also going to be expecting you to look at physical risks. So these are, the actual risks from extreme weather events, so floods, fires, hurricanes, and the like. And they want to understand, any assets that might be impacted by those future weather scenarios. And then finally, looking at you're going to have to provide metrics and targets. And this sort of really gets down to, providing your scope 1, 2, and possibly 3 greenhouse gas emission data. Also looking at in different ways, like intensity of carbon per products and services and things like that, just different KPIs that will be useful for stakeholders and investors to understand the risks associated with your operations, and making sure that you're tracking to targets and goals over time. So in line with, talking about those metrics and targets, the main one here is in relation to calculating your greenhouse gas inventory. And Dave is going to take it from here to go over the details of GHG protocol and inventories.
All right, thanks, Neil, and hello, everyone. I just want to go back to what Neil said a few minutes ago regarding the greenhouse gas inventory. The SEC proposed ruling would require public companies to start reporting their scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, and some as early as in 2024, with scope 3 emissions to be reported 1 year later. I know everyone who's done carbon accounting realizes this, but the carbon accounting can be a very complex and challenging process. So the sooner you start, the better prepared you'll be when it comes time to start reporting your emissions. So don't wait till that last minute, because it'll be too late. So I thought it would be helpful, just in talking about the greenhouse gas inventory, I really like this diagram that's from the GHG protocol, and I thought it'd be helpful to kind of run through that diagram. for those attending today's webinar who may not be as familiar as others with the term scope 1, 2, and 3, this is a great visual aid to help you understand what the terms mean. So I'll go through it kind of quickly, but it'll give you an idea of what scope 1, 2, and 3 represents. So starting with scope 1, which is represented by the arrow in the middle of the diagram. Scope 1 emissions are the direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources owned or controlled by the company. So just some examples would include emissions associated with fuel combustion in boilers or furnaces, refrigerants that escape from maybe it's air conditioners or refrigerators in the assessment period, and gas and diesel that's used in company-owned vehicles. Also, another example, if you have a backup generator and the generator was used in the assessment year, the fuel to run the generator would also fall under the scope 1 category. Scope 2, which are indirect emissions and represented by the arrow in the upper left-hand corner, they are emissions which primarily result from the generation of electricity purchased and consumed by the company. They're considered indirect emissions because the actual emissions are derived from the activities of the power company. So the emissions happen at the location of the power company, but they're indirect for the company reporting or calculating their emissions because they're responsible for the consumption of electricity. And just some examples I wanted to throw out there of the different types of data that you would need to collect for scope 1 and 2. That would include gas and electricity bills, fuel consumption, as I mentioned earlier, for cars or company-owned vehicles. Maybe it's fork trucks if you're into manufacturing. Refrigerants that were purchased in the assessment year would also be a type of data that would be required to calculate, that would fall under scope 1, but to calculate your scope 1 emissions. The scope, then moving on to scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 includes all other indirect emissions not already accounted for that occur in a company's value chain. And these are shown in the lower left and lower right-hand corner of the diagram. And they're broken down into upstream and downstream activities. So you'll see the upstream activities on the left-hand side, downstream activities on the right-hand side. And in total, there are 15 scope 3 categories. And I won't go through them all, but just a few categories to point out that typically are a pretty big portion of a company's overall footprint. On the upstream side, purchase goods and services, almost all companies we've worked with have had, have needed to calculate their purchase goods and service impact because it is a significant part of their overall footprint. Waste generated in operations, business travel, and employee commuting are additional examples that would be applicable to most companies. And then on the downstream activities, you have processing of sold products, use of sold products, end of life. And if you have franchises, there's a category 14 is based around franchises. And if you're in the financial industry, the last category, investments, would be applicable to you. So those are just a few of the 15 scope 3 categories. The data collection and emission calculations are more challenging for scope 3, more complex than they are for scope 1 and 2, and I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But I do want to note the importance of the scope 3 emissions. Typically, they account for more than 50% of a company's total greenhouse gas inventory. And I mentioned the downstream categories. Many of these are specific to product manufacturers. And for these companies, their scope 3 emissions can account for 90% of more of their total inventory. So you can understand the importance of including scope 3 in your inventory. So since scope 3 emissions are such a large part of a company's overall greenhouse gas inventory, I wanted to talk just about some of the challenges with calculating scope 3 inventory. So the complexity, I mentioned scope 3 is more complex than scope 1 and 2. Under the GHG protocol, many of the scope 3 categories have multiple methods and data types for calculating the emissions. Just for example, with purchase goods and services, you could collect supplier specific data, scope 1 and 2 emissions from your supply chain, or you could base your calculations on mass and volume data of what you're purchasing, or perhaps it's spend data, what you've spent on the year for purchase goods or purchase services. And with each different data, you'll use a different calculation method, which requires different emission factors. So it's a little more complex. The scope 3 calculations are a little more complicated and complex than scope 1 and 2. Also, for activities such as transportation, you have to be able to determine if you account for shipping emissions. Maybe it's in scope 1. Or it could be scope 3 purchase goods and services if it's further upstream in your supply chain. Could be scope 3 upstream or downstream transportation, and shipping could also potentially fall under scope 3 leased assets. So you really need to understand the method of the shipment and where exactly it falls within the different categories that I mentioned. It's not as straightforward as shipments to your facility would fall under the scope 3 upstream transportation and distribution, and shipments out of your facility would fall under downstream, scope 3 downstream transportation and distribution categories. So it's more complex than that. From there, just relevancy in material. As I mentioned, there are 15 scope 3 categories. You first need to determine of the 15 which are relevant for your company and need to be assessed, and then determine if they are material and need to be included in your final inventory. Data availability, data quality, and data gaps. It's all about the data. I tell our clients when we start working with them, don't take shortcuts on the data. And I stress that your inventory is only as good as the data you provide. So really put the time and effort into collecting good quality data, and it'll be reflected in your footprint. For data availability, you're going to be developing your greenhouse gas inventory for the previous 12 months. And so with your current systems, will all the data you need for the past 12 months be readily available? If the data is not available, where do you go to get it? Do you know where to get it and where to find it? Data quality will have a big impact on your overall inventory. Spend data, for example, is perfectly acceptable under the GHG protocol, but spend-based emission factors are conservative and will result in overstating your emissions. So spend data may be the easiest to get, most readily available, but from a quality perspective may not be the best data when you're calculating your footprint. So should you instead pursue a higher quality level of data, such as actual data from your suppliers? And that in itself can be problematic, just whether or not your suppliers have done a scope 1 and 2 calculation and are able to provide that information to you. And then data gaps, you should expect to get data gaps, and you need to know how to address those gaps. Data gaps are pretty typical from our experience when calculating an inventory, especially in the first couple of years. Just a couple of examples of data gaps. If you lease your buildings versus owning them, You may not have access to utility bills. Maybe your utilities are included in monthly rent, and you're not able to separate those out, or you have a landlord who's not participating and helping you to determine the actual utility consumption. Then you need to come up with a way to be able to estimate those emissions through some other means. Another example that we see quite often is around employee commuting. Companies may not have access to their employee commute distances or the methods of commuting. And sometimes there's pushback from human resources about sending out a survey to employees to get that information. So again, it's a potential data gap, and you just have to be prepared and know how to close and resolve those gaps. Then moving on, just resources. Always a question that we get is how much can we expect? How much time can we expect our people to put into if it's just the data collection side? So the data collection process can take, again, depending on systems that you have and how readily available the data is, but the data collection can take as long or longer than actually calculating the greenhouse gas emissions. So my advice is to have somebody who's dedicated to managing the data collection process and managing the overall inventory process, whether it's being done in-house or working with an external expert. Have somebody that's dedicated to overseeing the overall process of the greenhouse gas inventory. Typically, 2 to 4 months is a pretty good time frame for collecting data, but it really just depends on the company and the data systems that are in place. We worked with a client at SES that ended up taking over 8 months to provide the necessary data for us to finish calculating their inventory. So it really, like I said, 2 to 4 months is pretty typical, but it could be more, it could be less, just depending on the company. And then Neil mentioned this earlier, but the greenhouse gas inventory requirement could go beyond public companies. As Neil noted, that over time, as companies refine their greenhouse gas inventories and the data they're using for their inventories, it's very likely they're going to go into their supply chain, whether a company's public or private, and ask them to provide their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Some of you, in fact, may already be getting these requests. So just for public companies, just be aware of that. You should consider how this ruling may impact you and be prepared for it. Okay, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this just shows the process that SES has developed when working with clients to calculate their greenhouse gas inventory. Everything starts with the project initiation. We provide a data request form to our clients and ask them to fill that out for each of the different categories that are relevant for them, and then provide that back to us in the next step. Once we get that data request form back, we'll review the data request form, look for data gaps, review the data quality, make sure there's no double counting that takes place. Sometimes we see information provided in the purchase goods and service category that may also be associated with business travel. So we'll go through, review, look for those gaps, talk to you about gaps and how to close them, and do a quality, a QC check of the data, just looking to see if there is any double counting that's taking place, or if if something in the data just doesn't make sense. From there, we go on and develop the greenhouse gas model for doing the actual calculations. With that, we do a lot of research and compiling of emission factors And I've mentioned emission factors a couple of times now. I should probably explain what those are in case you don't know, but what an emission factor is it's a unit that allows us to convert an activity data like miles traveled to a quantity of pollutant released. Typically, it's in measure of metric tons of CO2 equivalent per unit or kilograms of CO2 equivalent per unit. And so it's a way to convert all the data you've provided over to CO2e. From there, then we actually use the model, we calculate the inventory and build out a customized greenhouse gas management tool. That management tool I'll get into a little bit more on the next slide, but that's a way for you to self-calculate your inventory in future years. And then moving on from there, we complete the inventory. We will provide a draft greenhouse gas inventory report. Provide that to you to review, and then we'll finalize that report. And then the last step is provide you with the deliverables, which would be that inventory report, and then the greenhouse gas management tool, along with training to go with that. So just in summary, just to be clear, carbon accounting is very specialized. For those companies who have not started or are just starting their journey into the world of a carbon accounting, we highly recommend seeking professional expertise. Even companies who have been self-calculating their inventory for over a number of years, have a professional review and verify your results. It'll help, especially as you start getting into assurance and verification and reporting. Having somebody just go through and review those numbers first will be beneficial to you in the long run. The entire inventory development process is going to take time and resources. So as I mentioned earlier, start early, don't wait until it's too late. I mentioned earlier the greenhouse gas management tool from SES. SES offers an inventory solution that balances subject matter expertise of our team and a practical greenhouse gas management tool to fully support our clients. The tool will be customized. We customize that tool to fit your situation. So not every company is the same. There's always something unique when we're developing an inventory for a client. So we customize that tool to fit your situation. We build that out during the initial inventory calculation, and then we would turn it over to you so that in subsequent years, you simply upload your data into the tool and then self-calculate your inventory. We do provide training on the tool. We realize that turning it over to you and just letting you walk away with the tool is not the best way to approach that. So once we turn the tool over to you, we ask you just to kick the tires, so to speak, for a few weeks and get familiar with it, how it works. And then we'll schedule some time with you, follow-up training sessions to ensure you're totally comfortable with the tool before you start using it. And we also deliver a training manual for you to use, which gives you more information and acts as a refresher in case you've forgotten what we've gone through with you. And then last thing is just SES will provide you with what you need to build a successful greenhouse gas inventory year over year, and while also preparing you for verification. So with that, I will turn you over to Tavio, who will cover the assurance and verification steps next.
All right, thank you for that, Dave. I'm Tavio Benetti. I'm the program manager for our greenhouse gas footprint verification program that handles our corporate verification services. So today I'll start with the question of why do we need verification? So once your organization has prepared its inventory, you may be wrestling with this question, whether or not to have it verified. So the simple answer is that organizational inventories, they're a complex system. They're often multi-layered. They involve interconnected data management systems, and also a big factor, human interactions at various levels and often regions of the organization. They are also dynamic, which means they evolve over time as changes occur year over year to the organization, but also the data systems and methodologies themselves. So with a diagram on the screen, this is intended to represent a very simple representation of data flows through a typical inventory system. Your inventory will likely look much more complex than this diagram. So as a simple walkthrough, starting from primary data, what Dave mentioned, things like invoice records from energy purchases, that's collected and entered into your data system, which then connects to your calculations, conversions, and aggregations, and finally is output in your inventory totals, what's known as the greenhouse gas assertion. So at the end of the day, your stakeholders are only seeing this output of the system, your greenhouse gas assertion, and they want to know that those final numbers, they're reliable. However, errors can appear at any of the various levels of the inventory system. So on the right-hand side are a list of common errors that are typically encountered at these various levels of your inventory system, and they're highlighted as examples of what might be uncovered as a result of the verification process. So at the end of the day, the overall objective of the verification is to provide that independent third-party review of the system, identifying and evaluating the magnitude of any errors uncovered, and ultimately the impact upon that final greenhouse gas assertion. The goal here is to issue an opinion on that assertion and whether or not there's any material discrepancies present in that final output. So the materiality threshold is a number typically set at plus or minus 5%. So as long as that output is within plus or minus 5% of this independent review, we can proceed with a positive verification. It's important to note that material discrepancies, they may be the result of a single error in the system or a combination of a number of different errors that show up throughout the system. So what does the verification process actually look like? It's broken up into 5 stages. In this first stage of pre-engagement, this is where we really define what the project looks like. We sign all of our contracts and also assess any conflict of interest that SES may have with the reporting company and the staff that have been assigned to the verification process. Following that, once all the contracts are in place, we can proceed with beginning the verification process and the second step of verification planning. So this stage involves an initial review of the inventory. We'll ask you for an initial set of data requests, and we'll perform a high-level review of the inventory and perform what's known as a risk assessment. And this is identifying key areas, key drivers of the inventory, and areas that in the verifier's opinion have the highest potential for error. And from those areas identified as high risk, in that sense, we will design verification activities to address those areas and test those portions of the system. From that, once the design of the verification is in place, we'll proceed with the verification activities. And this is really where we perform all of our evidence gathering tasks, recalculate a sample of all the emissions data, and we'll report any findings back to the client. So any errors, omissions, discrepancies that we uncover, we'll report back to the client, and they have the opportunity to perform necessary corrective actions to the inventory and resubmit a revised inventory for final approval. So once we've closed out all of those findings process, we can move to the 4th stage of completing the verification. And in this sense, the verifier, verification team drafts our process in a detailed report that covers, what process we underwent, and then also a separate document, the verification statement, that is intended to be a high-level summary of the results and the verification opinion. From that, it goes to one final stage, the independent review. And this is where a team member, totally separate from the verification team, reviews all of the work completed to this point and issues an independent opinion whether the process was conducted according to the objectives of the verification and the result was deemed to be correct. So with that, we're able to release that verification report and statement following all those phases to the client. So one of the considerations for verification is what's known as level of assurance. So at a basic level of assurance is a specification of the level of rigor and the type of conclusion at the outcome of the verification process. So typically broken into two defined categories, limited versus reasonable. Limited is less rigorous and less costly than reasonable. However, it still offers a high level of value, and we see that consistently with our clients. Limited will largely assume many of the controls established to generate the inventory are reliable, whereas reasonable involves more evaluation and testing of the inventory control structures. Reasonable assurance may also involve redesign of evidence gathering techniques throughout the verification as new information is obtained. So at this point, the SEC proposed rule includes a phased-in approach, starting with a limited level of assurance and later moving to a reasonable level of assurance for companies that fall up under that attestation requirement. So in terms of timing, this is an important consideration as you plan your inventory systems, is that the verification process itself takes typically between 2 to 3 months. It's really important to note that immediately ahead of any common reporting deadlines, so whatever the deadlines are determined for the SEC reporting, other public reporting protocols such as CDP, that a lot of your peers are also attempting to meet those reporting deadlines. So the few months immediately preceding those deadlines are always the most busy. So factors that influence how long the verification process timing will take, and also the resulting cost. A big one is the size and complexity of the inventory. So not all inventories are the same. You may be an organization with a handful of offices, or you may be an organization with thousands of reporting units dispersed across the world. So that size and complexity is a big driver in timing and cost. There's a few areas that are really under our client's control in terms of how to accelerate the time and move through the verification most efficiently. So a few of those: documentation of any of your inventory methodology, the amount of transparency of the inventory data and calculation structures themselves, and then finally access to supporting evidence, including any knowledgeable staff and data records that are requested throughout the verification process. The final piece that will affect ultimately the amount of time it takes to complete is the number of issues that are uncovered, the amount of findings, and how quickly both the client and verification team can move through correcting anything necessary in the inventory and then re-verifying those results. So the main message I want to end with today is do not wait. You really want to connect with our team, reserve your verification slot, and do everything you can to have your inventory prepared and ready to go on day one. So with that, I'll kick it back over to Karen for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Tavio, and thank you to all of our speakers today for taking time away from their busy work schedules to share their knowledge with all of us. I just want to say that to wrap up, that next steps really are to begin incorporating climate risk into your ERM and governance structure per the TCFD. If not currently created, please look to create your greenhouse gas inventory in accordance with the GHG protocol very quickly. And it's a good idea to get independent expertise to review or assure your greenhouse gas inventory. So in wrapping up, before we dive into some questions, I would like to say that SCS is committed to staying abreast of the developments regarding this ruling. The ruling is not final yet, and we probably won't hear the final ruling till toward the end of the year. But once we do get the final ruling, we will do an update to this webinar with any follow-up definitive information that we glean from it. We will be following up with some webinars this fall that are a little more in the, deep dive into some of these topics. Again, update on the final ruling. But previous to that, we will do a webinar on the actual verification process, which Tavio just sort of, kind of gave you a summary of. And then also the TCFD scenario analysis. We're planning a webinar on that. So now we'll dive into some questions. I actually can take the first one, which was someone asked why we were focusing so much on scope 3 when scopes 1 and 2 are going to be the first thing that are going to be necessary to report on. And what I would say about that, and Dave, feel free to jump in and add to anything that I say, is that the scope 3 accounting is more complicated and tends to require much more technical expertise. So it's a good idea to, and because it's largely a big part of your overall footprint, so it's necessary to know what your scope 3 is. So that's why we recommend getting your hands around that. We had a question which I think probably got answered. What someone asked what material meant when it comes to scope 3. And Dave, maybe you could just say a few words on, in any additional definition of, what material means in the context of scope 3.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. It's when you're calculating your scope 3 emissions, you're going to potentially have a category where it's less than 1% or it's 0.5% of the overall inventory. At that point, you're trying to decide if that's really important given the low percent of the overall footprint, and that's what we mean by if it's material. If it's not of significant consequence, then excluding it from your inventory is acceptable. There are different definitions when it comes to material. In carbon neutral certifications, for example, the carbon neutral standards will say anything that's greater than 1% needs to be included in the inventory. So there are different definitions around material, but it's really setting a limit on what needs to be reported versus what can be excluded from your inventory.
Great, thank you. Neil, I'm going to let you take this one. Because TCFD works with CDP, it seems as though a lot of the reporting questions are similar. Will companies be required to report to both TCFD and CDP?
Yeah, CDP has aligned since TCFD was published. So they've aligned some of their questions with what TCFD is expecting. So in preparing for either one, you'll be accomplishing, essentially what the SEC is going to be asking for. It's not determined yet exactly how the SEC will be expecting you to report and on which forms. That's really going to come out probably on the final rule. Will they just expect, some of the final numbers to be in there? Where will you need to be talking about risk? And they may look at things like CDP or voluntary reports like a sustainability report. They may accept that. They may expect that everyone just report on their standard forms. So you may be repeating it, is what I'm saying, if you're also putting out a TCFD report or index and also reporting to CDP, and then also on top of that need to report to SEC. We'll hear more from the way that they'll be requiring disclosure
right
on release of the final rule.
Right. And there was a question about what we realistically expect to stay in and what they might not keep in the rule. And I don't think that really anyone has a crystal ball at this point to be able to determine that. Would you agree, Neil?
Yeah, it's hard to know at this point. I think there's people threatening lawsuits. The same sort of thing happened with the conflict minerals rule with the SEC. There was lots of lawsuits about it. So I expect that there's going to be something similar here. I think they're probably getting the most pushback on scope 3 because that's complicated for folks. But we'll see.
Yeah. And then there was a question about what determines the accelerated reporters, large companies, and that is in fact determined by revenue, correct?
It is. There's a calculation that the SEC makes based on annual revenue and a public float. That's not an area that we're an expert of, but if you're a publicly traded company and you're already reporting to the SEC, you should already know what bucket you fall in,
Right.
or you can find somebody internally that knows.
Right. Dave, maybe you could take this one. Someone asked, doesn't scope 3 reporting inherently cause a lot of double counting when you look across multiple organizations reporting? And I know you touched on it briefly, but maybe you want to add a little detail to that.
Yeah, that's a question that does come up a lot. So I think it was Neil in the presentation had mentioned that a company's scope 3 emissions will also include supply chain scope 1 and 2 emissions. So I guess the easiest answer to that question is yes, there is double counting that does take place between suppliers and their customers. But that's just how that's the way the protocol is set up, GHG protocol, and it does have portions of your supplier's emissions as part of your scope 3 emissions as the customer.
And then
Yeah, I would just add to that, and just say that there shouldn't be any double counting between companies' scope 1 and 2, and that's what a lot of the rules are, that you're clearly defining your boundaries. I mean, that's part of the hard part about some of this, is just defining the boundaries and getting them, your emissions in the right bucket. But scope 3 it's well known that there's overlap and double counting amongst scope 3, just based on the way it's set up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And then there was a question that just sort of follows on with this. Sorry, where is it? What if suppliers won't report? What do you do when you have a supplier that isn't giving you information?
I mean, this is the and Dave can answer this too, but this is the hard part about scope 3. Most everybody's using proxy data to estimate information because they're not getting reliable data from their value chain. And even if you look at some of the major databases like MSCI and others, it's a lot of their estimates for supply chain greenhouse gas emissions are based on industry and a standardized emissions factor for that industry. And so over time, though, the problem with that is that if it's based on averages and proxy data, you can implement expensive and detailed initiatives to reduce your scope 3, and you'll never see that if you keep using averages and proxy data. And so over time, there's going to be more pressure to get real data, and it's just going to take time to get that information and that expectation to the value chain.
Yeah, and Karen, just to add to that, we are seeing more and more companies developing their or calculating their carbon footprint, and that's starting to cascade down into medium and smaller size companies. But the reality is we're just not there where suppliers are going to have that. A number of suppliers are going to have that information. It's going to take some time, as Neil said. But I mentioned in the scope 3 discussion that the protocol, GHG protocol, allows other methods for calculating the various scope 3 categories, like mass or like spend, as proxy calculations, until we get to that point where where more actual data is available.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just want to reiterate for everyone on the call that we will be sending out a copy of this recording to all attendees and registrants tomorrow. So that's a repeated question here. Will there be an expectation on the attestation part, Tavio, that companies move from limited to reasonable assurance? And is there specific guidance expected on that? And I don't believe we have that answer, but what we have seen with many of our large reporters is sort of a continuum of, starting with scopes 1 and 2 limited, and then, kind of gradually increasing. But Tavio, I thought I'd let you just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I can speak to what's in the proposed rule with the caveat that, still everything is not final in that. But the way the currently proposed rule states it is that existing accelerated filers and large accelerated filers have 1 fiscal year to transition to providing a limited assurance, and then 2 additional fiscal years to transition to providing reasonable assurance with respect to scopes 1 and 2.
Right. There were quite a few questions actually on that topic. So I think maybe we could take one more. Someone asked who was the best internal point of contact at SCS, and we will be having a follow-up email. So you'll get an email with the recording this week, and then next week there'll be another follow-up email with a list of contacts and topics for, obviously it's a different person point of contact for verification versus inventory compilation. And with that, I think we are at time. Let's see if we could squeeze in one more. How can, I think that we've kind of looked at most of the sort of large buckets. There are some specific questions about specific industries, but we can easily take those offline. So I do want to thank our speakers again, and I want to thank everyone for attending today. This has been a very important conversation. It's something that will continue to unfold over time, and you can call on us when you need help, and we look forward to working with many of you in the future. Thank you so much.